Morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. I'll never forget the first time I got that sinking feeling in my stomach after somebody looked at me and they said, you're just a spitting image of your dad, right? Has that ever happened to any of you where somebody compares you to your parents and say you're just like them or you got the same personality as them? One of my favorite commercials, which I'm probably dating myself, I don't even know if they show this one anymore, but my favorite one used to be those progressive commercials where it was, people that are my age and they got this life coach in their life that's telling them and saying, dude, you're becoming just like your dad, you need to knock it off. And so in one of the commercials, he's passing by a garbage bin that doesn't belong to him and it's piled high with yard waste, and he's so upset by that. He says, you're not supposed to put yard waste in the trash bin. And the guy says, dude, nobody cares. It's not your trash. Move on. It's like we pick up these silly habits from our parents, and it's not just the way we look, it's the way that we live. And it's interesting to me how often our culture picks up on just that reality. It's just a self-evident truth. We have songs about it. Old man, look at my life. I'm a lot like you are. We have a litany of sayings, and just kind of looking some of them up. People talk about somebody being a chip off the old block, or we say like father, like son, or like mother, like daughter, or they're cut from the same cloth, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I like the variant on that one. There's a saying that says, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Sometimes it lands in its neighbor's yard and pretends it doesn't know the tree. And it goes both ways, right? You're arguing with your kids, and then they talk back to you, and they say something, and you go, I used to say the same thing. They're becoming me. I'm arguing with myself. I'm arguing in a mirror. And so it's just this kind of scary inevitability in our lives that we inherit certain traits from mom and dad. And so this is something, again, our culture picks up on. We got sayings, we got songs. But I also believe it's something that the Bible clearly speaks to. It's so obvious that the world acknowledges it, but also the Bible has already been talking about it for thousands of years. And so I want to be really clear. I don't believe in the concept as it's often talked about, this idea of inherited sins where Adam sinned and then we just inherit Adam's guilt, and so God holds us accountable for something we didn't do. But I do believe in inherited sins in this specific sense. Adam's sin set the human race on a trajectory. It introduced this environment, this set of circumstances, that no matter how you slice it, at the very least we say it created the circumstance where it's inevitable that we all eventually sin. And we inherit habits that sometimes span generations. I know one family that when they were thinking about getting married, the woman came from a family that had never had, as far back as they could go, as far back as anybody knew, had never had a successful marriage. Every marriage had ended in divorce. And so they're blazing this new path. They have a healthy, good marriage now, but that's not an accident. That there is a pattern, there's a cycle, whatever it is in your family, that often repeats itself over and over and over again throughout generations. We see this with things like alcoholism. My Grammy was a very faithful woman, and she was a marriage counselor, marriage and family counselor, and she would always have all these cliches that my brothers and I like to mock and make fun of, often was the case. But there was one thing that she would say all the time that I think was as true as anything else that she said throughout her life. And she said, very often, we recreate the homes we were raised in. We recreate the homes we were raised in. Whatever home you were raised in, however good, however bad, understand this, that's your normal. But also understand this, that your normal might not actually be that normal. It might be abnormal. But to you, it's all that you know. And so when we get married, as an example, how do we, what does it look like to be a husband? What's a good husband? What's a good wife? How do you deal with conflicts? How do you make decisions as a couple? Understand, it's human nature. You're going to almost by default fall back on what? The only marriage that was modeled for you. The only marriage that you saw every single day. And that is the one between mom and dad. You'll almost subconsciously fall back into doing things the way that they did things, settling disputes the way that they did. And it's the same thing with parenting. Or how we cope with a crisis. We look at mom and dad and we remember how they coped with crises, and we often pick up those same patterns of behavior. Maybe alcohol and anger and lashing out. Those are the things that we see modeled for us that can easily become our own habits later in adult life. That is to say, if we are not extremely intentional in breaking it. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning, is this idea that we are all part of some sort of family cycle, and that could be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, but certainly if it is a negative thing, if there's just a pattern of wickedness in my family that I'm raised in. I was raised in maybe a traumatic situation where, there's just a long line of messes that came before me. Today I want to encourage you to say it ends with me. And at the very least, aim for changing the trajectory of your family tree. The trajectory of the lives that come after you. And so I talked about how this whole idea of kind of generational sin, I think that we see that in the Bible, and we kind of receive consequences to a certain extent, even of our own fathers. And I think that we see this in Exodus chapter 34, verse 7, amongst other places. But this is a good place to start, where God is revealing himself to Moses. You remember that. And God had promised Moses that he'd cause his glory to pass by him. And the thing that's really glorious about this story is not so much that Moses got to see God's back, although that's pretty great too. But it was how God, in his own words, describes himself. And he says this, God is speaking of himself. He says that he keeps steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. This is sometimes a difficult passage for us who don't believe in original sin. We say, why would God visit the iniquity of our fathers to the third and fourth generation? That doesn't seem to make sense, or doesn't seem to be just in our minds. But I think it's really simple how we deal with this verse. It's saying exactly what we've already discussed up to this point. The sins of our fathers, while they alone are held accountable and held in the judgment for their actions, nonetheless have a ripple effect in our lives as well. The sins of our fathers, or the good deeds of our fathers, have this potential to set us on a trajectory where we're more likely to do something than if they had not have done it. In fact, Exodus 20 has almost identical wording, but I think it has this slight addition that makes it clear what Moses is saying, or what God's saying through Moses. And so this is the Ten Commandments, and he's saying, you shall not bow down to graven images, in Exodus 20 and verse 5. And he says, I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. And so what God is saying is very simple, that if you're raised in a family that hates God, how much more likely are you as an adult going to hate God? It becomes very, very much more likely. And so what this is saying is that God visits in judgment the iniquity of the fathers to the third and fourth generation, that where that pattern continues, God will judge. He will execute judgment. And so when people talk about the phrase inheriting sins, what I'm really talking about this morning is repeating sins. The habits that we see in our parents that are bad, that are missing the mark, that we repeat, that's what I mean by inheriting sins. We see them and we just pick up where they left off, and we're repeating this cycle over and over again so that our children will pick up where we left off. And so you see this pattern. There's all sorts of examples in this in the Bible. I'm most mindful of the sin of Jeroboam. He's the first king of the northern nation of Israel. As soon as he becomes king, he sets up, golden calves, a couple places in the northern nation there, sets up this whole new way of worshiping God that was false and idolatrous and pagan. And who came along and corrected it? Nobody. From the time he did this, they never recovered. And actually, they got worse and worse and worse and worse. That's just one example. Look at the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. It starts with Abraham, who is a really good guy. We can acknowledge that. A great man of faith. He's known as the father of faith, but we also recognize Abraham wasn't perfect. And he shows at least one point in his life this willingness to lie and deceive when he's trying to deal with this famine. And he goes to Egypt and he lies to the king about his relationship with his wife. And then later on, one of his sons repeats that same exact sin in Isaac. And then what do you know? Jacob and Esau come along, and both those guys had their own issues. But did you know that the name Jacob, it means to grab somebody by the heel, but the root means something like, you can translate it as a deceiver. And that's kind of what characterized Jacob, at least early on in his life. He was a trickster. He was a liar. He sneaks in and dresses up like his brother Esau, even goes so far to put fur on his arms to make it seem like he's got the same hairy arms as his brother Esau, and tricks his dad into blessing him when he intended to bless Esau. And it doesn't stop there. Jacob has 12 sons. And just like how their father Jacob had kind of betrayed and tricked and deceived his brother, what do you know Jacob's sons do? They see this man, Joseph, their brother, coming, and they say, here comes this dreamer. They betray him, sell him into slavery, go back to their dad and deceive him, trick him into thinking that Joseph had been mauled by a wild animal. And so here's the scary thing. When we repeat the sins of our fathers, oftentimes we don't simply repeat them, but we build on them. Again, look at Adam, and then look at the next sin after Adam. It's his son Cain. And you go from taking a piece of fruit that you shouldn't have taken to all of a sudden one of your sons murders the other one in cold blood. If we are not intentional, this is what happens. We repeat the sins of our fathers, but actually, often is the case, we actually build on them and delve deeper and deeper into sin. And so, I want to clarify something here, that the sins of our fathers might be a cause for forming us and shaping us, and it contributes to who we are today. We can't deny that. On a certain level, it's inevitable. Our parents, our upbringings are going to have an impact on us. They are a contributing cause to who we are, but they are not an excuse. And so I want to be really as sensitive as I can to everybody in the room. I want to acknowledge that there are people in this room who have grown up in rough situations, where maybe you had parents that were cold or absent, or they were leading reprobate lives where they should have been home, nurturing and taking care of you, who instead, when they were home, was in the end worse than when they were away. And I want to acknowledge that the pain a parent can cause is perhaps deeper than any other wound, or that it's worse than any other wound that another human being could inflict upon us. Parents should be a source of safety, security, and stability, not the source of wounds which stick with us from one degree or another throughout the rest of our lives by making us their victims. There are people here this morning who are maybe made victims of their parents rather than made safe. But again, I want us to understand this. Our lives are still our own. And once we are adults, we are ultimately held accountable for our own actions. I'll give an example that's really extreme, but I think it makes the point clear what I'm getting at here. You know, a vast number of child abusers themselves were abused as children. And yet, when we hear about somebody doing that, our reaction isn't empathetic. Obviously. Because as tragic as the childhood trauma was, it is not an excuse for what they chose to do in their adult life. Our legal system holds them totally and completely responsible for repeating the sin that was committed toward them, and rightly so. And so if you were raised in a particular turbulent or traumatic environment, I want you to hear Ezekiel 18, and this goes for all of us, not just those people. And I want us to see that our parents' iniquity might be a cause for our dysfunction, might be a cause for the habits in our lives, the sins we commit later in adulthood, but they are not an excuse. Ezekiel 18, verses 2 through 4 says, "What do you mean by repeating this proverb concerning the land of Israel? The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. As I live, declares the Lord God, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins shall die." In the book of Ezekiel, this is, of course, the generation that is first wave of exiles, and then later on they hear about the city and the temple falling. But this is the first wave of those taken captive in Babylon. And Ezekiel is part of that captivity, and he is preaching to these people, and he is systematically, in Ezekiel, exposing their sins. You know, the corruptness amongst the priests and the elders, and how people were committing idolatry and paganism and oppressing their neighbor, and they were violent, and in the worst cases, they're sacrificing their sons and daughters to false gods. He is systematically exposing the sins of this generation, but they had this proverb. This saying that they used to describe why they ended up where they were. They said, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. If you've ever eaten sour candy, you know what this metaphor is getting at, right? You eat sour candy and all of a sudden you pucker up and there's a sensation that you get from that. Your teeth are set on edge, is how Ezekiel would put that. But imagine your mom and dad eat sour candy and you still get the sensation even though you didn't eat anything at all. What Ezekiel is getting at, and what this proverb was getting at, and how it was used to describe their predicament in those days by the people, is they were saying, we didn't do anything wrong. Our fathers committed all the sins, and we're the ones that are paying the consequences. And what Ezekiel's saying is, no. Everybody is punished according to their own actions. And so if you turn from your wickedness and you commit righteousness, you will live before God. If you are wicked, the soul that sins shall die. It doesn't matter if your parents sinned. God is holding each person into account, irrespective of their blood ties to each other. Each person is held into account for their own actions. And as you go through that, one verse stands out to me, and that's in verse 9. Because to me, when I read that sounds like good news. That I'm not going to be judged eternally based on what my dad did or my granddad did, but I can choose to follow God today. And if I do that, He's going to forgive me. I'm going to live. I'm going to stand before him. That sounds like good news if you're going into exile and are these people. And yet, when you get down to verse 19, Ezekiel is anticipating that the people are going to object to that. That there's going to be pushback. And he says, yet you say, in verse 19, why should not the son suffer for the iniquity of the father? When the son has done what is just and right, and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall surely live. To me, I read that, I'm going, what? Why is Ezekiel expecting pushback from that? Why would the people object to this idea that each person's held into account independently of one another? And I think there's multiple reasons. I think it tells us that they had a better understanding of group, collective judgment in some ways than we did. They understood that your sin doesn't just impact you, it impacts your whole family, it impacts your whole society, but they pushed that worldview and that idea too far to the point where one generation might be punished for their father's sins, although the current generation is totally innocent. The only reason it makes sense to me as to why the people would push back against this principle that Ezekiel's laying out, listen to this. There is something convenient, as strange as it may seem, about the idea of being punished for your father's sins. The convenience is that it absolves you of taking any responsibility for your sins. So you need to be aware. The way in which our parents raised us can be a genuine tragedy, and we're compassionate about that and empathetic towards that, but at the same time understand that it can become our greatest and most convenient excuse in adulthood if we want it to. There comes a point in life where claiming victimhood becomes less and less helpful. Where at a certain point we have to strive to move from the mindset of victim and into the mindset of victor. A point where we must face honestly the reality of our parents' sin and our own and say, it ends with me. And so, of course, the question is, how do you break this pattern? Again, it doesn't help just pointing fingers and blaming. It might help us understand why we are the way we are and get to some root cause of things. It might help with some healing to a degree, but at a certain point, it doesn't help necessarily in making and breaking the cycle. Ezekiel says something really interesting in this passage in Ezekiel 18. He lays out and describes a hypothetical scenario where he says, imagine that a father is righteous and he has a wicked son. That father is going to live and the son's going to die. And he says, but imagine that wicked son, he himself has a son. And listen to what Ezekiel says in verse 14. Suppose this wicked man fathers a son who sees all the sins that his father has done. He sees and does not do likewise. He withholds his hand from iniquity, takes no interest or profit, obeys my rules, and walks in my statutes. He shall not die for his father's iniquity. He shall surely live. You notice what's going on there. He sees all the sins that his father has done. But he doesn't just see them. He commits to not doing likewise. That was one of the more valuable things in my life. I had an influence in my life that wasn't great, and somebody came up to me and said, I used to have somebody in my life that was like that, and I just decided whatever they did, I was going to do the opposite. And that was really important advice to me. Maybe if there's any upshot to being raised by wicked parents, is that it makes what the right thing to do more clear, where you can pretty much just say, what did they do? And I'm going to do the opposite. And you'll probably end up in a better place than what they put you in. The task is for us, and all of us, really. We have this way, especially when we're young, to see our parents with rose-tinted glasses, and I want that to last as long as possible, but I also want us to get to a point in life where we understand our parents aren't perfect. And if your parents are doing things right, they embrace that. They want you to know that too. And so, like that man in this little story Ezekiel gave, we need to see, we need to reflect, first of all, on our own lives. What are the patterns I'm repeating? But then also at the same time, evaluate your parents honestly. And I'm talking evaluate them in comparison to the Bible. See the sins and the shortcomings, for all it's worth. See it so that you can figure out how to do differently. And then finally, repent. You know what keeps generational sin going? You want to know what your superpower is in breaking the cycle, is doing, if you're raised by particularly wicked, tough parents, here's your superpower. Here's the thing that they can never learn to do that messed your life up and had a negative impact on you. Repent. Words like, I'm sorry, I messed up, I blew it. Without that, you are not breaking the cycle. Neither am I. That is your superpower in breaking the cycle of sin that exists in your own family. Having the courage to say it ends with me. But of course, for us, there's something even more specific as far as the solution goes. For us, the solution really comes down to Christ. It's Christ who breaks the cycle. And I'm so encouraged every time I go and I see, they're so easy to read over, but we're given Jesus' genealogy, two different sides of it in Luke and in Matthew. And you go through Jesus' genealogy, and it was not a perfect people that he came from. He descended from the very people Ezekiel is addressing, actually. And you go through Jesus' genealogy, and pretty much every sin that you can think of, somebody did it. One of his ancestors did it. Whether it be murder, whether it be adultery, whether it be lousy fathers, whether it be idolatry, whether it be stealing, whether it be, there's even prostitutes on there. Every sin that you can think of is in Jesus' genealogy. And you know what? He broke the cycle. Now, I want to be straight up about this. You're not Christ, and neither am I. We'll sometimes open our mouths and find inadvertently that we sound like mom and dad. We'll stumble, we'll fall short. But here's what the goal is. The goal is not perfection. It's going to be hard. It's like you took a fork in the road, and 30 miles into that journey, you're realizing you went left when you should have gone right. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard to get back onto that path that you should have been on. But here's the question. Are you changing the trajectory? Are you putting your family on a different direction than what you were put on? That's the question. It's not am I perfect? Did I fully succeed in breaking the cycle? It's am I changing the trajectory? I believe you begin to do that when you repent and commit your life to following in the footsteps of Jesus rather than the iniquity of our fathers. Jesus bears the curse of our sin. And then in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 17, it says we're a new creation. We get this brand new, fresh start. Your family tree, your previous habits, which you learned from your parents, the cycle that you've been repeating in your own life, when you commit your life to Christ, all of that vanishes from your record. You get a new start. And even more than that, here's the beautiful thing. You get a new family to learn a new and better way. And I'm talking about the household of God. Paul says to be imitators of God as beloved children. Again, he says in Romans 8 and verse 15, if you did For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Again, I've said this many times before, but the promise of the gospel is not to save you, just to save you from sin or your family's sin, so that we might avoid hell. It is to free us from sin, so we might also avoid creating hellish consequences that impacted us and the lives of other people around us, so we might live life abundantly. So here's what I want to say and finish with. You are not doomed to being a chip off the old block. You are not destined to recreate the home you were raised in. You can put your home on a new trajectory if you decide today it ends with me, by committing to follow Christ and walk in his footsteps rather than the sins of our fathers. If you're here this morning and you would like that new start that we talked about, or if there's any other thing that perhaps we can help you with or pray over you for, please meet me in the back as Steve leads us in 743 in the Red Book. It's me.